Wow, you guys look great. So sorry if I'm a little hoarse. I've got the plague, but I've lost my voice. I'm high on cough syrup, so let's let the public speaking begin. So I'm here with my friend Chris to share some of the things we've learned building applications for Shopify and using the Shopify API. We're going to talk about this for a little bit, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Please fire up your apps and log those questions or vote up other ones. We promise to give you time. So first of all, some important thoughts. I work with Shopify Core. Shopify Core Engineering builds the Commerce OS, which powers Shopify and helps everyone deliver value to our merchants. We're the ones bringing to you such API hits as the Orders API, inventory, fulfillment, discounts, products, collections. You get the idea. The engine of commerce. Part of this is we steward these APIs, and we support these platforms. And we support our partners. And sometimes we're supporting our partners at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, trying to figure out what's going on. In this process, we've learned a lot of things that aren't necessarily immediately obvious. A lot of them are our own hard lessons, and a lot of them lessons learned by others. And we want to share those to help you build better apps today. So specifically, the first one is merchant scale. I got one ahead of myself. Merchant scale is a concept that we reference internally a lot because things that work in a quick dev shop don't always work in the real world. So it's worth defining what real world means. And for our purposes, real world means this. Now, these are not averages. We actually pulled these numbers specifically for you, for app developers. These represent the sizes of each of these quantities of objects which address most of the merchants who buy most of the apps. It's a little bit vague, but generally what you can assume is that if you have a development test store that's about this big and things perform well and your app generally works, you can expect it to work pretty well out in the real world. It's important to test these things before they go out, and it's important to have a development store this large. It can also be a bit of a pain to build. If anyone out there wants to build an app to quickly build these development stores, I'd love that. I'd buy that. So this is merchant scale. Now, what do we do to be able to work with merchant scale? A few examples. First and foremost, smart collections. Now, I really recommend using smart collections. I'm not here to make any product announcements yet. But smart collections are where we're putting most of our energy and most of our new development in supporting collections. This is as opposed to manual collections. Now, a little bit of background. A manual collection is an object in Shopify for which you specify every product in that collection and the order of those products in that collection. That doesn't scale well. It doesn't scale well to merchant scale. It gets increasingly heavy the larger a collection gets. Smart collections, on the other hand, are rule-based. And that's great. That's great for a lot of reasons. One reason it's great is because it lets us deploy a new and exciting data model in the back end, which is going to raise the performance by orders of magnitude for large collections. The other reason is that it enables all sorts of interesting, safe functionality, like if you make a collection that, say, is called pants, and it includes all the pants in a store. When you create a new product of type pants, it will automatically be in that collection. Smart collections are a powerful concept. We're investing in it, and we're going to increase the value it delivers this year. We're also going to increase the presence and functionality that we share with merchants, and we're hopeful that our app partners build on smart collections even further to better exploit the power of the platform and this really important concept of like a tag and dynamically based collection service. So yeah. The next concept of merchant scale, which is important to think about, is other apps. The number of apps that you are coexisting with in a merchant store, in your merchant neighborhood. This is not the average. Again, this is a specific number. This number is much larger than the average because of something called the friendship paradox. Has anyone ever heard of the friendship paradox? It's this funny idea. The friendship paradox states that your friends have more friends than you do, right? It's just a way of saying that people who have lots of friends are more likely to have you as their friend. Similarly, merchants who install lots of apps are more likely to install your app. So you should plan for a world where you're coexisting in a merchant experience with many other apps. And this is a bit anecdotal. I can't substantiate this, but I'm believe it's true. Merchants also will tend to install many apps that do the same thing. It's kind of a natural process. You install all these different apps that do the same thing, find the best one, and then go with that, not always uninstalling all the others. So be excellent to each other. And if you're an app, prepare to coexist with other apps. Some of the ways you can coexist with other apps. So one is to be a well-behaved fulfillment service if you fulfill orders. I'm picking on fulfillment services here for a little bit, but this applies in many other contexts. Specific, though, to fulfillment services, we have a model where if you are a fulfillment service, you can fulfill fulfillment orders, which are attributed to you, which are for you to fulfill. It's set up to allow that, and that means that we create fulfillment orders specifically tied to the fulfillment service, so there's no conflict or contention. If you don't follow this model exactly, or if you get a little ambitious, like you fulfill orders right away instead of registering as a fulfillment service, or fulfill fulfillment orders without necessarily making sure that they're yours first to fulfill, this can result in fulfilling the same order multiple times. And that's an existential threat for merchants. That's a really, really bad thing. We increasingly have to consider these bad actors. Again, fulfillment services are one example, but there are many. Another context for this is, updating things. And a way I could say this is, don't update things in response to things being updated. So an example of this, say you're watching a product or a collection, and you're listening to Webhooks, which is great. You should use Webhooks. I'll talk more about that later. When you listen to those changes, and whenever there's a change, just to be safe, you update the thing again to make sure that your tags are appropriately set or your data is right on that product. This is great. This works just fine. It's great in testing. It covers a lot of edge cases until someone else is doing it at the same time. And you can kind of see how this goes. You update the thing, and then they update the thing in response to your update. This friends don't let friends, and excellent app mates don't let app mates denial of service Shopify. Realistically, we'll probably be fine. We've got a lot of infrastructure. I promise your bandwidth costs will run out before our servers. But it's still something to be aware of, and something to be careful of when you build. I've talked a bit about scaling. I want to, at this point, promote the talk which immediately follows this one with Adam and Joe. They're going to do a great talk on scaling. Please hang around. So there are a few other non-scaling related areas that I wanted to touch on. First, webhooks. In some ways, webhooks are a scaling issue. Specifically, when you're using a webhook to update something like collections or things that can take a lot of work and have a slow update cycle, or times when you're polling, and the alternative to webhooks is to poll based on updated app and then just find the changes. This works well, and that's true. It is true. It's a scaling issue. It is also a really important user experience issue. And what we're going for here is we want your apps to feel integrated and connected with the admin. We want this a strong shared trust of everything that merchants see in the admin. And a key part of that is if a merchant updates something in one area or in one app, they should see it reflected in other apps, in your apps as well, right away. The way to make that happen is to respond right away, and the way to respond right away is webhooks. This is a big concern when merchants alternatively go from your app to somewhere else, and then data is different, especially data they're working on, and that's scary. So webhooks. Another thing to bring up is monitoring. A recurring theme here is if something's happening in your app, you should be the first to know. I mostly mention this because it's much easier than most people think. Within Google Cloud, and we use Google Cloud, you can set some Stackdriver alerts on your machine really quickly, and particularly on a load balancer. You can also do this on AWS. I like AWS. Personally, I mean, we support Google Cloud, and both services are great. I want to go a bit further, though, and suggest that you can be really interesting here. So the obvious ones are my app is returning 500 server errors. You can also keep track of 403s to identify failed logins and try to catch people who might be maliciously going after your app or going after merchant data. You can also keep track of the active connection count, how much load is on your server, and maybe send an automatic email to the CEO or to your sales team when you first hit 100 active users or 1,000. Pop the champagne. You can get creative with this, and there's a lot that you can monitor without doing any work besides a couple of clicks in your cloud provider. So we encourage you to do that. Almost done. OK, avoid unsupported APIs. It sounds obvious, and most of the time it is. But it's worth mentioning that we're about to tell you more about how we're building out this new web client for the admin, which is leveraging the new GraphQL APIs and is built in React. And a part of this means we're getting rid of the old one. And as the old API context and the old UI context goes away, we're going to be a bit more aggressive about deprecating and taking out APIs we no longer use. This can be hard on apps that grab that really useful Stack Overflow snippet just to do something on the edge case. It's worth taking a moment, knowing that this is coming, to look for anything like that in your code base. Finally, I encourage you to sunset your apps. And this is actually kind of an exciting point to have to make, because we've reached a great point in the Shopify app ecosystem. More apps are being created every day. It's a growing experience, but we're also some apps are reaching end of life. And that's fine. But we want to work with you, and we want to gently ease those apps out of the ecosystem. There are instructions of how to do this on our developer website. And we're really ready to work with you to make the end of your app's life as pleasant and exciting for merchants as the beginning, and also to make sure that there's room there and that trust stays high in app performance to keep our ecosystem thriving. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Delaney. At Shopify, we have a lot of experience building complex, dynamic web applications. And we wanted to give you access to the exact same tools and techniques that we use internally, so that whether you're building a new application or trying to level up an existing one, you can stand on our shoulders. Now, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of libraries that we're open sourcing today that we use internally. And you can see all of them by visiting the Shopify/Quilt repository on GitHub. But before I get into the details, I wanted to talk a little bit about the priorities we bring to web development, because every technical decision we make stems from these. The first and most important is that applications must be performant. An application that doesn't load quickly or doesn't respond well to user interaction simply won't be used for very long. Apps also need to be extensible. You need to be able to add new features in response to customer needs without the foundation of what you've built crumbling beneath you. And apps need to be maintainable. You need to be able to add tests and detect when there are regressions, ideally before they ever ship to merchants. So with these in mind, I'm going to talk about 5 pieces of a technical stack that we believe does an incredible job of addressing these priorities. I'll talk about how modern JavaScript lets you optimize for end-user performance, how React lets you break your application into easy-to-understand chunks, how GraphQL lets you get all the data that you need performantly, and how 2 libraries that we build at Shopify, Polaris and the Embedded App SDK, allow you to build absolutely beautiful applications that fit right in at Shopify. And this isn't just a set of recommendations that we're giving to you and then stepping away. This is a technology stack that we truly love internally, too. We've been building many of our applications on it. And as we've mentioned a few times at Unite, we've spent the past year and a half rebuilding the admin on this exact same foundation. So today, 50% of merchants using the web admin get an experience powered by the technologies I'll be mentioning today. Let's start with modern JavaScript. It has an incredible community, and the language itself has progressed to include many modern features, like separating code into modules and common object-oriented patterns like classes. But I want to talk a little bit about how you can use JavaScript and modern browser APIs to improve the performance of your application. Here's an example that we use frequently throughout the new web admin. We have a really expensive piece of code. It might be a part of the UI that isn't available on every single page, or isn't needed all the time on the pages it does appear on. But if you just include it in the single JavaScript bundle for your application, none of your app is actually usable until that complete file has been downloaded and executed. And this hurts the merchant experience. So what we do is a technique called code splitting. And you can use modern JavaScript and modern browser features to make it amazing. So here we're using async await, which is a new feature of JavaScript for handling async operations, as well as what's called a dynamic import statement, which splits out a part of the code in your JavaScript bundle into a completely separate file that you can load on demand asynchronously. And we make it even better by using a browser feature. On the right, you can see that we're using a preload link, which tells the browser to download that file in the background without hurting user interactivity, so that as soon as our code actually needs it, it's already cached and ready to go. So we get the best of both worlds. All the code's there, the app is responsive immediately, and the feature that they need is ready to go when the merchant is. Now, this won't run in the modern browsers that we support just yet, but you can use tools like Webpack and Babel to make use of this incredible modern language that gives you all the tools you need to optimize for performance. And if you really want to follow closely to how we're working at Shopify, we've become heavy adopters of TypeScript. TypeScript builds on top of modern JavaScript, adding features like member privacy and enums. And most importantly, it adds types. Now, why would you add types to JavaScript? Well, it helps the editor experience by giving you things like autocomplete. It also improves code expressiveness and the self-documentation nature of code. But the most important piece is that you're going to catch errors before they ever ship to merchants. Because TypeScript, when you use it to build your application, will tell you if you're trying to call a method that doesn't exist or access a property on an object that might be undefined. All of the libraries that we provide have TypeScript typings, so you can also be perfectly confident that you're using our libraries as they're expected to be used. Next, let's talk about React. React is a JavaScript library that provides you a framework for building complicated user interfaces. Here's a simplified version of how we might implement the product page in the web admin using React. If you've never seen it before, it probably looks like a weird mix of JavaScript and HTML. And in truth, that's really all it is. But what it allows us to do is incredibly powerful. You can see here, we've separated out parts of the user interface that on their own are incredibly complicated. Things like the rich text editor and the channel selector. And the implementation details are entirely up to that component. They just expose a very simple public API that the component rendering them can use. And if we build another page that needs a rich text editor, it's as simple as dropping this one-line code snippet into that component as well. We think this is a huge step forward in web development, and we'll be releasing many of the libraries that we've built around React in order to build the web admin and other apps at Shopify. Today, we're releasing a couple of libraries that will help you do server rendering in React, and over the coming months, we'll release the libraries that we use to do internationalization, forms, keyboard shortcuts, Google Analytics, and more. We're also releasing a number of libraries today around React testing, because once you've split up your application into small chunks, each of those chunks is really easy to test. The libraries that we're releasing are built around popular community libraries and help you mock out common parts of your application, like the router, GraphQL client, and common browser globals. We've talked about the language of your application. Let's talk a bit about the language of data. You've heard us talk a lot about GraphQL at Unite this year. We absolutely love GraphQL. And when we say that the new admin is based on GraphQL, we don't mean that we have some private version of the GraphQL API that's just for us. We've built the new admin on the exact same admin GraphQL API that you have access to right now. And we actually took it a step further. Since we were using this API, we said, why can't the admin just be an API client? So the new admin is just an API client, like all of your applications are as well. But how do you write GraphQL? Because it's still young and the patterns haven't been fully established. Well, here's some things that we found have worked really well for us internally. We recommend that you use static queries. This is where you write your query or mutation ahead of time when you're actually authoring your application, instead of compiling it together at runtime by concatenating strings. Now, this gives you a great editor experience because you can get syntax highlighting and auto-completion for what fields are actually in the API. But you'll also get build time warnings if you ever try to access fields that you don't have access to. Another way of preventing you from shipping errors to merchants. We also really like Apollo. It's what we use for the admin and for most of our other apps as well. It's a popular open source GraphQL client that takes care of running your queries and mutations. It also maintains a local cache of all of the results. So if you ever perform a subsequent query that needs data that's already in the cache, you get it instantly. So your application feels incredibly responsive. And finally, when you have this great typed data language like GraphQL and this great typed application language like TypeScript, you can get an even better experience. So today we're releasing the library that we use to generate TypeScript types from GraphQL files so that you can get strong typing throughout your entire application for the way that you're interacting with Shopify's API. It'll warn you when you try to build your application if you're trying to access any fields that you didn't actually query, or if you're trying to access fields that might return null from the API. Now, the user experience of your application is really where the buck stops. Merchants expect the experience of using an app to be at least as good as using the admin itself. And we think the libraries we provide give you the foundation to do just that. First, Polaris. It's our signature user interface library. It provides all the common components you see throughout our products, from simple buttons and text fields, all the way to incredibly complicated things like popovers, date pickers, and tabs. Now, last year at Unite, we released Polaris V1. It was the first time we'd ever shared it outside of Shopify, and we were so happy with the response we got from partners. This year, I'm excited to talk a little bit about what's in Polaris V2, which is already available for you right now. There's a new version of the style guide that's really beautiful. It includes improved documentation on the components, as well as documentation on how to use components together and how to use design and content primitives to build a truly great user experience that goes beyond what Polaris gives you by default. We'll also soon be moving to have Polaris developed completely in the open, so you'll get an exact list of what components are being worked on. And yes, we'll finally be accepting PRs from the community. But a UI library wouldn't be very exciting if there weren't any new UI components. So let's talk through some of those. This is a really popular one that people have asked us for a lot. It's a brand new data table component. It works great whether you're on a big 27-inch monitor or on a mobile phone. And we use it throughout reports and other areas where we have to show data. So it'll be great for you to use that as well. We also have a brand new drop zone component that works in a variety of sizes, anywhere where you need to accept images or files from a merchant. And we've made big improvements to resource list to support the really complicated use cases we want to use it in. It now supports searching, filtering, sorting, and bulk actions. And finally, the embedded app SDK. The best experiences keep merchants in the context of the admin. And the embedded app SDK lets you do just that by living right alongside the rest of the admin frame while controlling key pieces of the UI. And it works whether you're being rendered in the web admin, the mobile apps, or soon POS. We've completely rewritten the embedded app SDK to make it easier to extend in the future, to give you developer tools so you can see what's going on under the hood, and to provide you a dummy application frame so that you don't have to open your application in a test store just to develop it. And the best thing about all of these picks together is that they just work so beautifully when used in concert. Here's an example where we're using React, Polaris, and the embedded app SDK together. We're pulling in the page component from Polaris. And the page component knows that if it's being rendered inside of an embedded app, it needs to communicate its title, breadcrumbs, and page actions up to the parent page, whether it's the web admin or the mobile app. And you don't have to worry about it at all. You just use the same simple declarative API that you'll find documented in the Polaris style guide. So that's it, a whirlwind tour through 5 pieces of a technology stack supporting 3 incredibly important priorities. These, in conjunction with the API recommendations that Delaney has laid out, will help align you really closely with how we're building Shopify internally, and we believe will allow you to build the absolute best merchant experiences. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll open the floor to questions. No questions, sweet. So we actually don't have any questions. So if anyone has them, please put them into the app. We're happy to answer them.
I'm fine just giving people their time.
Yeah, well, I just want to see if anything. Oh. Has anyone tried to submit a question and it hasn't gone in at all? Yeah, we have. Can we get the mic to... Where'd my person go?
Tech support.
I was told I was not allowed to leave the bubble of the stage. Can we get a mic? Who is it back there? Yeah, it's not loading, so I think the Wi-Fi must be weird.
Yeah, this is not working at merchant scale. It's
We're new to GraphQL, but in the session that we just attended earlier this afternoon, we were learning about, I guess, what it's going to look like to work over large data sets.
Yeah.
That's something that we've discovered is quite easy to do using the REST interface, given the endpoints that are available. We can work on large data sets easily in a concurrent manner. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case with GraphQL, given that cursor construct. I'm just wondering, given that we're trying to work at scale, what mechanisms might we be expecting through GraphQL to be able to continue to work concurrently over these large data sets?
Yeah, I think we'd mostly defer to the GraphQL team if that's a use case that you're worried about. I think they need to know that because there are pretty strict limits in place for most paginated fields, and we're aware of that. So if you think that's going to be restrictive for your use case, talk to us, talk to the GraphQL team. We want to understand that use case. We've mostly focused on it in response to the UIs that we've been building, and for a UI, it actually imposes some really good restrictions because you never do want to load 1,000 results. You want to load a small number and then load more on demand. But yeah, if you're using it in order to perform operations from a pure API perspective, then let's talk and we'll figure out what that should look like.
Yeah, and one thing to add, and I'm not saying this isn't the case for you, but oftentimes there's a temptation to iterate over a whole set or pull down all the data and work with it locally, where it's possible instead to kind of use Shopify as your database and pull out only the subsets of data that you need to display to the user or work with at a time. So if there's another important thought, I would say use Shopify as your database or as your data backend where it works. And I don't know if that works for you.
Do we have any other questions that didn't go through the application? We're good? Nothing else in the app?
App's still dead.
App's still good?
Nothing on the app.
OK. Cool.
Okay.
All right. Well, if you have any other questions, find us afterwards. And thank you all very much for listening. Really appreciate it.